He was born in Hama, Syria, and he devoted himself to study and spiritual practice there in his youth. Later, following the guidance of an unknown spiritual mentor, he traveled to Mecca, where he spent 15 years engaged in inner purification, worship, and ascetic practices such as fasting and night vigils. These practices were a significant part of his spiritual journey and are often reflected in his poetry. Eventually, again, upon the direction of the same mystic, he returned to Egypt, where he spent the rest of his life among like-minded individuals, including Iranian emigrants, while compiling his poetry, particularly his masterpiece al-Kubra. He passed away in a state of ecstatic devotion and was buried in the Muqattam cemetery in Cairo. Ibn al-Farid's full name was Umar, and his honorific titles included Abu Hafs and Abu al-Qasim. His father, Abu al-Hasan Ali, held a position in legal documentation and religious rulings, which earned him the title Farid, a recorder of legal documents, and his son thus became known as Ibn al-Farid. Although his family was originally from Hama, Ibn al-Farid was born in Egypt in 576 AH. His father declined the prestigious position of Qadi al-Qudat, chief judge, and his grandfather was known as Murshid, spiritual guide, suggesting a family tradition of piety and mysticism. Following his family's scholarly background, Ibn al-Farid pursued studies in literature and religious sciences. Some accounts suggest he attained a judicial position which he later abandoned to devote himself to ascetic practices near Cairo. Occasionally he returned to the city to visit his father but found no inner fulfillment. Eventually, through the guidance of one of the Rijal al-Ghib, hidden saints, he traveled to Mecca, where he continued his mystical journey free from family ties. His poetry frequently references Mecca and the Hijaz, and upon his return to Egypt, he nostalgically recalled the spiritual states he experienced there. Sultan al-Malik al-Kamil of the Ayyubid dynasty sought to meet him, but Ibn al-Farid declined the invitation and even refused the Sultan's gifts. He later moved to Alexandria and returned to Cairo only when he was near death. Even when the Sultan offered to have him buried next to his mother's tomb, he refused, and chose to be buried at the feet of his spiritual mentor, known as Sheikh al-Bakal, near the mosque of al-Arid on the Muqattam Heights, where he had often worshipped and practiced asceticism. He passed away in 632 AH, and his funeral was said to be extraordinary, with his tomb becoming a site of pilgrimage. During Ibn al-Farid's lifetime, the Islamic world was under attack from the Mongols in the east and the Crusaders in the west. In response, the spirit of Sufism, with its emphasis on resignation, submission, and annihilation of the self, became dominant. External defeats led people to seek refuge in the inner world. However, Sufism also had its opponents, and Ibn al-Farid faced criticism even during his lifetime. Despite this, he remained steadfast and indifferent to criticism, continuing to observe religious rituals. I returned to outward acts of worship as a habit and prepared my spiritual state as my provision. The desires of the self distracted me from my invocations, so my divine inspirations ceased, and my recitations did not last. Was Ibn al-Farid a Sufi of the traditional Kanka, monastic lodge system? He was not. Instead, he pursued an independent spiritual path. His mentor, Sheikh al-Bakal, advised him to go to Mecca, where divine openings would occur. He followed this advice, remaining in Mecca for 15 years before returning to Egypt upon a mystical sign, as documented in Nafahat al-Uns 539 to 540. In his poetry, he describes stages of asceticism and worship. I fasted my days, seeking divine reward, and spent my nights awake, fearing divine punishment. I turned away from my homeland, severing all ties. Even with my companions, I chose solitude. I refined my soul through ascetic discipline to unveil what customs had concealed. Fasting, night vigils, renunciation, lawful sustenance, self-purification, all aimed at transcending worldly habits to perceive divine truths. However, upon his return to Cairo, Ibn al-Farid led a luxurious life. He was known for his elegant attire, pleasant fragrance, and dignified demeanor. He owned a house in Upper Egypt where musicians and singers would perform for him, and he was so sensitive to rhythm that even the slightest sound could send him into a state of spiritual ecstasy. Ibn al-Farid's poetry exclusively expresses his mystical states and thoughts, referencing almost no contemporary events. This suggests that he and his admirers lived without worldly struggles. Unlike Hafez, who in his most mystical poems still alludes to the burden of time's sorrow, Ibn al-Farid lived in comfort, seemingly free from material concerns. He accepted no gifts but gave generously and was highly respected by rulers and elites. In his final moments he envisioned paradise but wept, saying, "This is not what I desired." A voice asked, "What do you seek?" He whispered, "I long for divine vision." His face lit up with joy as he passed away. Apart from what can be gleaned from his poetry, Ibn al-Farid's biography was recorded by his grandson Ali in the introduction to his Diwan, though it contains exaggerations and bias. Other historical accounts, such as those by Ibn Khalikan and Ibn Imad al-Hanbali, have been utilized by scholars, including Muhammad Mustafa Hilmi in his book Ibn al-Farid and Divine Love, from which much of this discussion has been drawn. Both his supporters and critics admire Ibn al-Farid's poetry. In the 6th and 7th centuries and beyond, no Arabic poet could compare to him. The themes of his poetry are predominantly ghazal, love poetry, and kamriyat, wine poetry, often serving as symbols of mystical states and divine love. Some speculate that he may have had romantic experiences, but those who see him purely as a metaphysical poet interpret all his verses allegorically, sometimes in a forced manner. His most famous mystical poem is his Kamriya wine ode, followed by the Ta'a'iyya Nazm al-Suluk. The latter has attracted criticism and numerous commentaries. Mysticism and religious law followed separate paths, sometimes clashing between the 2nd and 4th centuries AH. Al-Junayd sought to bridge this gap, emphasizing that they were not mutually exclusive. However, al-Hallaj's trial deepened the divide, and only with al-Ghazali's influence did Sufism gain official recognition within Sunni Islam. Ibn al-Farid, unlike al-Ghazali, focused on divine love rather than knowledge. Intoxicated by love's wine, my eyes found rest, and the goblet before me was the face of my beloved. Ibn al-Farid's concept of divine love transcends rational knowledge and reflects a profound mystical experience in which love is the foundation of creation. Ibn al-Farid and his Sufi life, through his poem al-Kubra, a rhetorical and analytical study by Father Joseph Scatolin, introduction. The mystical poetry left to us by the Egyptian Sufi poet Umar ibn al-Farid, d. Cairo, 632 AH, 1235 CE, has remained and continues to be a perplexing enigma for those who attempt to decipher its mysteries and understand its meanings. Many early commentators and later scholars have studied this issue, yet none have claimed complete success. Ibn al-Farid's poetry remains a subject of doctrinal disputes and theoretical debates. The complexity of this issue has been further compounded by the association of Ibn al-Farid with the Sufi school of Ibn Arabi, leading to a conflation of the two mystics' meanings and objectives. As a result, Ibn al-Farid's poetry has been predominantly interpreted through the lens of Akbarian Sufi philosophy, which has imbued his verses with the doctrine of Wahdat al-Wujud, the unity of existence, to this very day. However, we must ask, is this approach a fair representation of Ibn al-Farid's mystical experience? And does this method of interpretation truly reflect his intended meanings? This question became the starting point of our research, which we conducted on his famous poem al-Kubra. We approached the study through a semantic analytical methodology, examining the poem's vocabulary to extract meaning from within the text without resorting to external or foreign philosophical concepts. What we present here is merely a summary of our research findings. We hope that this study will benefit those exploring Ibn al-Farid's poetry and that its conclusions will satisfy his admirers and lovers.